Yu-Gi-Oh cards are normally used to play the game of Yu-Gi-Oh, whether that be through summoning monsters, destroying cards, drawing cards, whatever. But for a game with almost 12,000 cards, some Yu-Gi-Oh cards decide to go a little bit more direct. These cards are directly designed to annoy, confuse, or downright gross out your opponent. We'll start with the most classic example with yugioh Friendship and Unity. Yugioh Friendship has the effect: offer your opponent a handshake. If they accept your handshake, each player's life points become half the combined life points of both players. And if you have Unity in your hand and show it to your opponents, they must accept the handshake. By itself, yugioh Friendship is probably just going to get your opponent to say no, but with the help of Unity, you can force your opponent into a handshake. Some clever min-maxers thought about how can we use that to our advantage, and decided that making their hand as gross and unshakable as possible was a good way to mess with their opponent. Of course, Konami, watching out for their player base, decided that all you had to do was accept the idea of a handshake, instead of having to reach over across the table and shake nubs with someone's greasy hands. Next up, we have the card Question, which has the effect: when activating this card, your opponent cannot check cards in the graveyard. Your opponent calls the name of the first monster found at the bottom of your graveyard. If he or she calls it right, the monster is removed from play. If he or she calls it wrong, the monster is special summoned to your side of the field. This card's interesting in that you basically hold the game state hostage as you ask your opponent questions about their graveyard. I don't really know how this card works in person. I don't know if you just slap the card down and flip over their graveyard before they can read any cards in it. Unsurprisingly, the card is also completely uncoded and unplayable in Master Duel. Next up, we have a Weevil Underwood Classic with Parasite, which has the effect: flip effect, shuffle this card face up into your opponent's deck. If you draw this card after it was added to your deck by its effect, special summon it in defense position, and if you do, take 1000 damage. All monsters controlled by the player that summoned this card by its effect become insect monsters. Putting one of your cards face up in your opponent's deck is just a recipe for weird disasters. For example, when players shuffle and cut, they can see the face up card. Players are going to do everything in their power to try and stack the deck. Not to mention, if for whatever reason you forget, there's a pretty good chance your opponent's just walking away with your Parasite. If playing Yu-Gi-Oh isn't really your style while you're playing Yu-Gi-Oh, you can play other games with the help of the card Transmission Gear, which has the effect: during damage calculation, if your monster battles an opponent's monster, play rock, paper, scissors with your opponent. Make the losing player banish the battling monster they control face down. If you're a believer that there's a science behind RPS and that you are the chosen one, then this card's probably for you. Not to mention the actual removal effect of having your opponent banish their own card face down is pretty dang good. Next up, we have a pair of cards that basically do the same thing: Drop Off and Drastic Drop Off. Because they do the same thing, we're just going to read Drop Off's effect. Drop Off has the effect: when your opponent draws for their normal draw in their draw phase, your opponent discards one card they just drew. Admittedly, this one requires a little bit of explaining, but basically, because the card requires you to discard the exact card that you just drew, it can lead to some weird shenanigans. Legend has it that some players try to shark with this card by allowing their opponent to draw, shuffle the cards as you normally would, and then activate Drop Off. And because you have no way of verifying which card that they drew, you get an irreparable game state, and maybe you can weasel a free win. Whether or not that ever actually happened is lost to time, and in reality, the actual problem with this card can just be fixed by talking to your opponent. But maybe the mental damage of, hold on, I do have something in your draw phase, might mess with your opponent a little bit. Next, we have a pair of old school cards that do basically the same thing in very different ways, with Fiber Jar and Ring of Destruction. If you somehow aren't familiar with these legendary cards, Fiber Jar has the effect: flip effect, each player shuffles all cards from their hand, field, and graveyard into the deck, then draw 5 new cards. An OG Ring of Destruction, because it's been eroded a bunch of times, has the effect: destroy one face-up monster card and inflict direct damage equal to the destroyed card's attack to the life points of both you and your opponent. If you see these effects and you don't see the through line between the cards, both these cards make your 3-game set into a 4-game set into a 5-game set. Ring of Destruction's original effect allowed you to force out ties, and when you're trying to win a best of 3, a tie isn't really doing anyone any favors. Fiber Jar's effect is very similar in that regard, especially in older Yu-Gi-Oh! Where setup was a lot longer. Shuffling all cards back into the deck and drawing another 5 may as well have just been playing a new game. Next we have the Danger cards, which is actually an archetype of cards and really fits into what I'd consider to be the mind-reading cards, where you ask your opponent to look at you and read your mind, and then punishing them when they lose. That said, all Danger monsters have the similar effect structure of, you can reveal this card in your hand, your opponent randomly chooses one card from your entire hand, then you discard the chosen card. Then, if the discarded card was not the activated Danger monster, special summon one activated Danger monster from your hand, and if you do, draw one card. Additionally, all Dangers have their own discard effects if they are discarded. Not to mention the Danger mechanic itself of flashing and then disappearing really does feel like a cryptid or a creepypasta that you might see out in the fields of West Virginia. You're like, whoa, it's Bigfoot! Turns out in Yu-Gi-Oh! There's a lot of cards that let you mess with your opponent. And if all else fails, I think a normal summon Fossil Dyna and a Skill Drain will probably do the trick. Ring of Destruction. If you've read